The Kralthex Empire had conquered 17 star systems in less than 100 years, and their method was always the same. They would find a new civilization, and they would send a message demanding total surrender, and if that civilization refused, then the Kralthex would destroy them completely. Their military was powerful and their technology was advanced, and they had never lost a war. Every species they encountered either bowed down or was wiped out, and the Kralthex expected nothing different when their scout ships detected radio signals coming from a small blue planet in an unremarkable corner of the galaxy. Commander Vexthor was assigned to lead the operation, and he reviewed the intelligence reports about the species that called themselves humans. They had basic fusion engines and simple energy weapons and a few space stations orbiting their homeworld. By Kralthex standards, they were primitives who had barely left their own planet, and conquering them would be easy. Vexthor had conquered 6 worlds already, and this would be his 7th, and he expected it to take less than a week. The Kralthex sent a diplomatic courier ship to deliver their standard message, and the small vessel traveled to the outer edge of the human solar system, where a simple beacon marked the boundary of their claimed space. The courier transmitted the ultimatum, and the message was clear. The humans had 30 days to surrender complete control of their world and their system to the Kralthex Empire, and if they refused, then a military fleet would arrive to take it by force. The courier did not wait for a response, and it turned around and left the system immediately. On Earth, the message was received by deep space monitoring stations, and within hours it was transmitted to every government on the planet. Panic spread quickly as people realized they were not alone in the universe, and that the first contact was a threat of invasion. World leaders gathered in emergency sessions, and the United Nations held a crisis meeting that lasted for 3 days straight. Some leaders wanted to negotiate and find a peaceful solution, while others wanted to prepare for war immediately, and a few even suggested surrendering to avoid bloodshed. Admiral Henry Blake was called to the Emergency Defense Council meeting in a bunker deep beneath the Rocky Mountains. He was 62 years old with gray hair and tired eyes, and he had served in 3 different wars during his long career. He had seen combat and death, and he knew what war truly cost, and he did not want to see it again. But he also knew that some threats could not be negotiated with. He listened to the politicians argue for 6 hours before he finally stood up and silenced the room with a single gesture. Blake spoke in a calm voice, and he told them that the Kralthex message was not an invitation to negotiate. It was a demand from a superior force that expected complete obedience, and any attempt to bargain would be seen as weakness. He explained that humanity had only 2 choices, and they could surrender and lose their freedom forever, or they could fight and possibly die, but die as free people. The room fell silent as everyone considered his words, and slowly the votes came in. Humanity would not surrender. Blake was given complete authority over Earth's defense, and his first action was to draft a response to the Kralthex ultimatum. He spent 2 hours writing it and rewriting it, and finally he settled on something simple and direct. The message said that the boundary marker at the edge of human space was not just a beacon, but a line that should not be crossed. Any ship that crossed that line with hostile intent would be destroyed without warning and without mercy, and the Kralthex should turn back now while they still could. When the message was transmitted into deep space, many people thought it was foolish and arrogant. How could humanity threaten an empire that had conquered 17 worlds when Earth had never fought a space war before? But Blake knew something that the politicians did not know, and he knew that for the past 40 years humanity had been preparing for this exact scenario. Commander Vexthor received the human response 3 days later, and when he read it, he laughed out loud. His officers gathered around and read the message, and they laughed too, because the idea of humans threatening the Kralthex Empire was absurd. One primitive species confined to a single planet was daring to draw a line in space and tell the mighty Kralthex not to cross it. Vexthor found it amusing and insulting at the same time, and he immediately ordered his fleet to prepare for invasion. The Kralthex invasion force consisted of 300 warships, including heavy battle cruisers and fast destroyers, and carrier ships filled with fighter craft. It was more than enough firepower to reduce Earth to a burning wasteland, and Vexthor planned to make an example of humanity. He would show the galaxy what happened to species that refused to bow to Kralthex power, and the humans would be remembered as a cautionary tale for centuries. Back on Earth, Blake watched the long-range sensors as they detected the approaching alien fleet, and the readings showed exactly what he expected. 300 ships moving in formation and heading directly toward the boundary marker, and they would reach it in less than 2 weeks. He turned to Colonel Lisa Martinez, who served as his second in command, and she was a sharp woman in her 40s with dark hair and eyes that missed nothing. Blake gave her a simple order, and he told her to activate Protocol Artemis. Martinez hesitated for just a moment, because she knew what that protocol meant and she knew the cost. But then she nodded and walked to the communications panel. She entered her authorization code, and then Blake entered his, and together they unlocked the systems that humanity had, built in secret for 4 decades. Around the solar system, hidden, weapons came online and massive railgun platforms buried beneath the surface of the moon powered up their reactors. Thousands of asteroids in the belt between Mars and Jupiter activated their guidance systems and began calculating firing solutions. Defense satellites in Earth orbit armed their missile banks, and every military base on the planet went to full alert. Humanity had prepared for this day, and now the preparation would be tested. The Kralthex fleet continued its approach and crossed the boundary marker without slowing down. Vexthor stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched the small blue planet grow larger on the viewing screens, and he smiled because he thought this would be easy. He had no idea that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life, and that mistake would cost him everything. The Kralthex invasion fleet moved through space like a swarm of metal. Predators and their ships gleamed under the light of the distant sun. Commander Vexthor stood in the command center of his flagship, watching the tactical displays and feeling confident about the upcoming battle. His intelligence officers had reported that Earth had mobilized approximately 40 warships to defend their planet, and Vexthor had assigned 30 of his ships to destroy them. It would be simple target practice for his experienced crews, and the rest of his fleet would move in to bombard the planet into submission. The alien warships approached the orbit of Earth's moon, and Vexthor expected to see the human fleet rushing forward to meet them in battle. That was how primitive species usually fought, and they charged at their enemies with courage but without strategy. However, the human ships did something unexpected, and they began pulling back toward their homeworld instead of advancing. The 40 human vessels retreated to high orbit above Earth and left the path to their planet wide open. Lieutenant Crescenal, who served as the tactical officer, reported the strange movement with confusion in his voice. He said that the enemy was withdrawing and opening the route to their homeworld without a fight, and he asked if this was some kind of trap. Vexthor considered the question, and in all his years of commanding invasion forces, he had never seen defenders abandon their positions so easily. It seemed like cowardice, but something about it felt wrong, and his instincts warned him to be careful. The answer to his question came exactly 60 seconds later, and it came with devastating force. The surface of Earth's moon suddenly erupted with light from hundreds of different locations, and the gray landscape that had seemed dead and empty was suddenly alive with weapons fire. Massive railgun platforms that had been hidden beneath layers of rock and dust revealed themselves in a perfectly coordinated attack. Each platform fired tungsten projectiles that weighed several tons, and these metal slugs were accelerated to incredible speeds by magnetic fields. The projectiles crossed the distance between the moon and the Kralthex forward fleet in less than 3 seconds, and at those speeds they carried more kinetic energy than nuclear weapons. The alien shields were designed to deflect energy beams and absorb explosive impacts, but they were not prepared for solid metal, traveling at such extreme velocity. The tungsten rods punched through the shields like they were made of paper, and then tore through the hulls of the warships. 28 Kralthex vessels simply ceased to exist in the span of 5 heartbeats. The ships were ripped apart by the kinetic impacts, and some exploded when their reactors were breached, while others just broke into pieces that tumbled through space. Only 2 ships from the forward fleet survived, and both were badly damaged with hull breaches and failing systems, and they drifted helplessly, trailing clouds of frozen atmosphere. On Earth, Admiral Blake watched the tactical display from the command center, and his face showed grim satisfaction. General Paul Henderson stood beside him and allowed himself a small smile as he read the damage reports. Henderson was a large man with broad shoulders and a shaved head, and he had been skeptical about the moon batteries when they were first proposed 20 years ago. Now he was glad that humanity had invested in them. Henderson reported that Phase 1 was successful, and the lunar railgun platforms were already recharging their capacitors for a second salvo. He added that the alien main fleet had stopped advancing and was holding position just beyond the moon's firing range. Blake nodded and told Henderson to send the message again and give the aliens one final chance to turn back. Aboard his flagship, Vexthor stared at the casualty reports in complete disbelief. 30 ships destroyed in seconds and hundreds of his soldiers dead, and the humans had done it with weapons that his sensors had not even detected until they fired. The intelligence reports had said nothing about railgun platforms on the moon, and Vexthor realized that his information about human capabilities was dangerously incomplete. These primitives had been hiding military technology that could challenge even Kralthek's defenses. A second message arrived from Earth, and the words were simple and direct. The message said that the Kraltheks had crossed the line, and now they should leave immediately or they would join their dead. Vexthor read the message twice and felt rage burning in his chest. No inferior species had ever humiliated the Kralthek's empire like this, and no commander had ever lost 30 ships so quickly. His pride was wounded and his honor demanded revenge, and he refused to retreat from primitives, no matter how advanced their weapons might be. Vexthor gave the order for his entire fleet to advance in full assault formation. All 300 ships would attack together with overlapping shields and coordinated fire patterns, and they would overwhelm the human defenses through sheer numbers and firepower. The commander told his officers that whatever tricks the humans had would not be enough against the combined might of the Kralthek's military, and Earth would burn for its arrogance. The massive alien fleet began moving forward again, and this time they came in a tight formation that looked like a hammer. Their shields were layered and interlocked to create a defensive wall, and their point defense systems were active and ready to shoot down any incoming projectiles. Vexthor was confident that this formation would protect his ships from the lunar railguns and allow them to close the distance to Earth. Colonel Martinez monitored the approaching fleet from her station in the command center, and her fingers moved quickly across her control panel as she tracked their speed and trajectory. She called out to Blake that the aliens were adapting faster than the tactical computers had predicted, and at their current rate they would reach Earth's orbital defense perimeter in approximately 9 minutes. The lunar batteries would get one more shot before the fleet moved past them. Blake remained calm, and his voice was steady when he gave his next order. He told Martinez to let the aliens come closer, and then he said 2 words that made everyone in the command center go silent. He said to activate the belt. Martinez looked at him for a moment, and then she nodded and began entering commands into her console. Between the orbits of Mars and Jupiter, humanity had been working on a project for 40 years, and it was a project that had consumed enormous resources and required the labor of thousands of engineers and workers. The asteroid belt had been transformed from a collection of random space rocks into the largest weapons platform ever created. Thousands of asteroids had been fitted with ion drives and guidance computers, and now they were ready to be used. The Kraltheks had no idea what was about to hit them, and Vexthor was still confident in his victory when the asteroids began to move. His sensors detected the orbital changes, but his tactical officers did not understand the threat until it was too late. The rocks were coming from every direction, and they were not coming in a single wave but in a carefully timed cascade designed to overwhelm any defense. The hammer formation that Vexthor had been so proud of became a death trap as asteroids converged on his fleet from above and below and from both sides. The asteroids came at the Kralthek's fleet like a storm of stone and metal, and there was no pattern that the aliens could predict or defend against. Some of the rocks were massive and measured several kilometers across, while others were smaller, but moved at terrifying speeds. The Kralthek's point defense systems opened fire immediately, and their lasers burned through space, vaporizing the smaller asteroids, but they could not stop the larger ones. The heavy rocks just kept coming, and they slammed into the alien ships with the force of planetary impacts. The tight hammer formation that Commander Vexthor had ordered became a disaster as ships tried to scatter and avoid the incoming bombardment. Vessels collided with each other in the chaos, and their overlapping shields interfered and failed. Some captains tried to maintain formation, while others broke away to save their own ships, and the result was complete disorder. The point defense lasers fired continuously until their capacitors overheated, and still the asteroids kept coming. 60 more Kralthek's warships were destroyed in the first minute of the bombardment, and another 40 took severe damage from glancing impacts or debris. The survivors were scattered across a volume of space that stretched for thousands of kilometers, and Vexthor screamed orders into his communication system, trying to restore some kind of organization. His tactical displays showed dozens of additional asteroids adjusting their courses and preparing for secondary strikes, and he realized that the humans had turned the entire solar system into a weapon. But Vexthor had not become a fleet commander by giving up when things got difficult, and he quickly formulated a new strategy. He ordered all surviving ships to punch through the asteroid field at maximum acceleration and head directly for Earth orbit. The logic was simple, and if his fleet could reach the space around the human homeworld, then the humans would not dare to use asteroids because they might hit their own planet. It was a sound plan, and Vexthor transmitted the orders to all his captains. Nearly 200 Kralthex warships broke through the bombardment and raced toward the blue planet at full speed. They were battered and damaged, but they were still a formidable force, and Vexthor believed he still had enough ships to win this battle. The humans had surprised him with their hidden weapons, but numbers still mattered in warfare, and 200 warships should be more than enough to crush 40 human vessels. Captain Ryan Foster commanded the human flagship, which was called the Defiant, and it was a heavy cruiser that represented the best military technology Earth could build. He stood on the bridge watching the approaching alien fleet, and he knew that his 40 ships were hopelessly outnumbered. The lunar batteries and the asteroid bombardment had hurt the Kralthex badly, but not badly enough, and now it was time for the human fleet to do their part. Foster opened a communication channel to all human warships, and his voice was calm and steady. He told his captains to remember their training and make every shot count, and he reminded them that they were fighting for Earth and for the survival of their species. The channel went silent, and then one by one his captains responded with acknowledgement, and Foster felt a surge of pride in these men and women who were willing to face overwhelming odds. The 40 human warships moved forward to intercept the alien fleet, and they did not move in a traditional battle line or formation. Instead, they operated in small groups of 3 or 4 ships, and they used the debris field from destroyed Kralthex vessels as cover. This was a tactic that Blake and Foster had developed specifically for fighting a numerically superior enemy, and it relied on speed and precision rather than raw firepower. The Defiant accelerated hard and dove past a Kralthex destroyer at a distance so close that the two hulls almost touched. At point-blank range, Foster gave the order to fire, and the main guns of the Defiant unleashed a concentrated barrage directly into the alien ship's engine section. The destroyer's shields could not handle the focused fire at such close range, and the hull was torn open. The enemy ship broke in half, and its fusion reactor lost containment and detonated in a brilliant flash of Flight Commander Kelly Wright piloted her corvette, which was named the Valkyrie, and she was threading through gaps in the Kralthex formation. At maximum speed, her ship was small and fast compared to the heavy cruisers, but it carried a weapon that made her entire crew volunteers. No one was forced to fly this mission because everyone knew the risks. As enemy fire tracked her position and plasma bolts burned past her hull, she accelerated directly toward a massive Kralthex battlecruiser. At the last possible second, Wright ejected her payload and pulled her ship into a sharp turn that pushed the hull stress to the breaking point. The torpedo she had launched was not a nuclear weapon, and it was something that human scientists had theorized about for decades, but never built until they had a reason. The warhead contained antimatter, and when it struck the battlecruiser's shields, the result was catastrophic. The initial impact released tremendous energy, but that was nothing compared to what followed. Matter and antimatter annihilated each other and converted directly into pure energy, and the explosion was brighter than a small sun. The battlecruiser's shields held for perhaps half a second before they collapsed, and then the ship itself was vaporized. The shockwave from the detonation tore through 3 nearby Kralthex vessels and damaged a dozen more. Aboard his flagship, Vexthor watched his fleet's advantage erode with each passing minute, and he could not understand how these humans were fighting so effectively. They used tactics that no civilized species would employ, including suicide runs and ramming maneuvers and weapons that seemed designed to cause maximum destruction even at the cost of their own ships. Every time his gunners locked onto a human vessel, it would disappear behind debris or accelerate in an unexpected direction. But despite the humans' skill and bravery, the mathematics of warfare could not be ignored. For every Kralthex ship that was destroyed, the humans lost vessels they had no way to replace. Foster watched his tactical display and saw that only 23 human ships were still combat-capable. They had fought brilliantly and exceeded every expectation, but they were running out of ships and ammunition and time. Then the planet Earth itself joined the battle, and thousands of targeting systems locked onto the Kralthex fleet. Every major city and every military installation and every converted civilian factory had spent the last 30 days preparing for this moment. Ground-based lasers and particle beam weapons powered up and aimed at the sky, and when they fired, the night side of Earth lit up like a second dawn. The beams lanced upward through the atmosphere, and individually, each one was relatively weak compared to ship-mounted weapons. However, there were thousands of them, and together they created a web of fire that no vessel could survive. Kralthex ships began falling from orbit with their shields overwhelmed and their hulls melting under the concentrated bombardment from below. Vexthor gave frantic orders for his fleet to climb to higher orbital positions, but that only made his ships better targets for the remaining human warships. General Henderson watched the battle from the command center deep underground, and his fists were clenched so tight that his knuckles were white. The casualty reports from the human fleet were devastating, and he knew that good people were dying in space above his head. But they were winning, and against all probability, humanity was actually winning this battle. Blake stood beside Henderson, and his face showed no emotion, but inside he felt the weight of every death. He asked Henderson for the status of the Kralthex flagship, and Henderson checked his displays before responding. The alien command ship was still operational, and their commander was pulling back to regroup with his surviving vessels. Blake stared at the tactical display showing the Kralthex flagship retreating to regroup with the scattered remains of the alien fleet, and he knew that this was a critical moment. If the enemy commander managed to organize his surviving ships and pull them back into formation, then the battle could turn against humanity again. More importantly, if any Kralthex vessels escaped the system and returned to their empire with detailed information about human tactics and weapons, then Earth would face an even larger invasion fleet in the future. He turned to Colonel Martinez and asked her a single question about whether the sword was ready. Martinez hesitated before answering, and her face showed the weight of what that weapon represented. She told Blake that yes, it was ready, but she added that the cost would be enormous. Blake's jaw tightened, and he said that he knew the price, but they had no choice. He gave the order to activate humanity's final secret weapon. High above Earth's atmosphere, a structure that had been disguised as an old telescope array began to change. Solar panels that had been folded against the frame extended outward like the wings of a mechanical bird. A barrel that measured 300 meters in length slowly rotated and aligned itself with the position of the Kralthex flagship. Banks of capacitors that had taken an entire month to charge began feeding power into the weapon system. The project had no official name in any military documents and was simply listed as Project stored in classified files. The engineers who built it had called it other things during the years of construction and testing. Some called it humanity's last chance, while others called it the planet killer, and a few had nicknamed it the Devil's Own Torch. It was a particle accelerator built in space and designed to fire a single devastating shot. Captain Foster saw the energy readings spike on his sensor displays, and he immediately understood what was happening. He transmitted an urgent order to all human ships telling them to clear the firing lane and get as far away as possible. His crews did not know exactly what weapon was about to fire, but they recognized the massive energy signature, and they knew it was something huge. The remaining human warships broke off their attacks and burned their engines hard to move out of the weapons path. Commander Vexthor also detected the energy buildup, and his tactical officer screamed a warning across the bridge. The readings showed power levels that were beyond anything the Kralthex had encountered before, and Vexthor realized too late that the humans had one more surprise. He ordered his flagship's shields to maximum power and commanded his pilot to execute evasive maneuvers, but the massive vessel was slow and could not build velocity quickly enough. The sword fired, and the release of energy was visible from Earth's surface as a streak of light across the night sky. A beam of accelerated particles focused to a diameter of less than 3 meters crossed the distance between the space station and the Kralthex flagship in a fraction of a second. The beam struck the forward shields of the alien vessel and simply punched through them as if they did not exist. Every material the beam touched was instantly converted to superheated plasma. The particle beam drilled through 30 decks of the flagship and continued out the other side and kept traveling into deep space beyond. Everything along its path ceased to exist in any recognizable form. The Kralthex flagship did not explode in the traditional sense, but instead it came apart as internal structure failed and secondary explosions spread through the ship. Sections of the hull peeled away like the skin of a fruit, and the vessel broke into dozens of pieces. There were no survivors from the flagship, and Commander Vexthor died, without ever understanding how badly he had underestimated humanity. The death of the command ship sent shockwaves through the remaining Kralthex fleet, because their entire command structure had been aboard that vessel. Ship captains suddenly found themselves without orders or coordination, and panic began to spread through the alien ranks. The Kralthex fleet, which had numbered 300 warships at the start of the invasion, was now reduced to fewer than 90 operational vessels. Some captains tried to rally their ships and continue the attack because retreating would bring shame and punishment from the Empire. Others looked at the tactical situation and realized that continuing to fight was suicide, and they made the decision to run. The alien formation, which had already been disrupted, now completely fell apart. Captain Foster watched the enemy fleet break and scatter, and he knew that the battle was over. His own fleet was down to only 11 functional ships, and his crews were exhausted after hours of intense combat. He did not have the resources to pursue the retreating aliens, and he did not want to waste more lives chasing ships that were already beaten. Instead, he opened a communication channel on all frequencies and transmitted a message that Admiral Blake had written days ago in preparation for this exact moment. Foster's voice was hard and cold as he delivered the message to the fleeing Kralthex ships. He told them that they had been warned before they crossed the boundary, but they had laughed at Earth's ultimatum. Now their dead had paid the price for their arrogance and their pride. He said that the survivors should return to their empire and deliver a message. Earth was not afraid, and humanity had not asked for this war, but they would finish it if the Kralthex ever brought conflict back to human space. The choice was simple, and the aliens could leave humanity in peace, or the next time Earth would bring the fight to their worlds. In the command center beneath the Rocky Mountains, the room erupted in celebration as the last Kralthex ships disappeared beyond sensor range. Officers were hugging each other, and some were crying with relief and joy. People who had been certain they would die today were suddenly alive, and their world was still intact. The impossible had happened, and humanity had defeated an empire that had conquered 17 star systems. General Henderson turned to Blake with exhaustion written across his face, but also with a smile. He said that they had actually done it and won a battle that everyone thought was unwinnable. Blake did not share the celebration, and his eyes were fixed on a different screen that showed casualty reports. The numbers kept climbing as damage. Assessments came in from the fleet and from cities on Earth's surface. 40,000 military personnel were dead, including the crews of 29 warships that had been destroyed in combat. The cities that had fired ground-based weapons at the Kralthex fleet had suffered retaliation strikes before the aliens were driven off. Civilian casualties were climbing past 100,000 and would likely go higher as rescue teams searched through damaged buildings. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to rubble, and fires were still burning in 3 major cities. Blake spoke quietly and asked what the cost of victory was. Henderson did not have an answer for that question, because no amount of strategic success could truly balance against the loss of so many lives. Martinez appeared at Blake's side, and her uniform was stained with sweat, and her eyes were red from staring at screens for too many hours. She reported that preliminary intelligence analysis suggested the Kralthex Empire would not attempt another invasion. Martinez explained that humanity had hurt the aliens badly, and they had lost their invasion commander along with most of their fleet. It would take the Kralthex years to rebuild their military strength, and by that time they would know that Earth would be even more prepared. She said that the Empire would likely mark human space as too dangerous to attack and focus their expansion in other directions where resistance would be easier to overcome. Blake nodded slowly and said that perhaps she was right, but he pointed out that humanity had revealed everything they had built. Every weapon and every tactic and every secret defensive system had been used in this battle. If the Kralthex did decide to come back, they would know exactly what to expect and how to counter it. The element of surprise was gone, and that had been humanity's greatest advantage. Henderson disagreed, and his voice was firm when he spoke. He said that if the aliens came back, then humanity would build new surprises, because that was what humans did best. Humans adapted and survived and overcame challenges that should have been impossible. The Kraltheks had thought Earth would be an easy conquest, but they had learned otherwise, and that lesson had cost them dearly. In orbit above Earth, Captain Foster guided the damaged Defiant back toward the repair docks that had been constructed on the moon. Through the viewports of his bridge, he could see Earth below, and the planet was scarred but intact. Lights still shone on the night side where cities continued to function. Humanity had survived, and that was what mattered most. Foster thought about the thousands of alien soldiers who had died in the battle, and he felt no joy in their deaths, but he felt satisfaction that his world still existed. Lieutenant Commander Greg Palmer sat at his tactical station aboard the Defiant and watched the retreating Kralthek ships disappear from his sensors one by one. He was exhausted, and his hands were shaking from adrenaline, and his uniform was soaked with sweat. The battle had lasted less than a full day, but it felt like he had aged years in those hours. He turned to Captain Foster and spoke what everyone on the bridge was thinking. He said that the aliens had laughed at humanity's warning, and now they were gone. Foster nodded, and his expression was hard as stone. He said that the Kraltheks had crossed the line that Earth had drawn, and they had paid the price for their arrogance. The survivors would carry a message back to their empire, and that message would be simple. Humanity drew lines for a reason, and anyone who crossed those lines with hostile intent would face consequences that they could not imagine. There would be no second chances and no mercy for those who threatened Earth. The communication systems were filled with status reports from other human ships, and the news was grim. 29 vessels had been destroyed completely, and another 8 were so badly damaged that they would never fly again. Of the 40 ships that had started the battle, only 11 were still capable of combat operations. Thousands of crew members were dead and many more were injured. The victory had come at a terrible cost. On Earth's surface, the damage was equally severe, and rescue teams worked through burning cities trying to find survivors. The Kraltheks had managed to fire several bombardment strikes before they were driven off, and 3 major cities had taken direct hits. Buildings had collapsed and fires were spreading, and emergency services were overwhelmed. Hospitals were filled beyond capacity, and doctors worked without rest to save as many lives as possible. Admiral Blake stood in the command center and watched the reports come in from around the world. Each new casualty number felt like a weight added to his shoulders, and he knew that he would carry the burden of these deaths for the rest of his life. He had made the decision to fight rather than surrender, and while that decision had saved humanity's freedom, it had also cost over 100,000 lives. There was no way to know if those people would have survived under Kralthek's rule, but Blake suspected that surrender would have led to even more deaths in the long run. Colonel Martinez brought him a final assessment of the battle, and her report confirmed what Blake already knew. The Kralthek's invasion force had been destroyed, with only a small number of ships escaping back to their empire. Earth's defensive systems had performed better than expected, but many of them were now depleted or damaged. The lunar railgun platforms had exhausted their ammunition and would need months to be resupplied. The sword weapon system had melted from the heat of its single shot and could not be used again without complete reconstruction. Blake asked Martinez what her analysis suggested about future Kralthek's actions, and she explained that intelligence believed the Empire would not return. The aliens had lost too much in this battle and would likely avoid human space in the future. However, she added that this was only an estimate and there were no guarantees. The Kraltheks might decide that revenge was more important than strategic sense and return with an even larger fleet. General Henderson joined them, and he carried a data pad filled with repair estimates and reconstruction timelines. He reported that rebuilding the damaged cities would take years, and restoring Earth's defensive systems to full capability would require enormous resources. The asteroid belt weapons could be reused, but many had been expended or had drifted too far from their positions. New asteroids would need to be equipped with guidance systems, and that work would take time. Blake listened to all the reports, and then he asked the most important question. He wanted to know if humanity could survive another invasion if the Kraltheks returned with greater numbers. Henderson and Martinez exchanged glances before Martinez answered honestly. She said that Earth could probably survive one more attack, but only if they had enough warning to prepare. If the aliens came back within the next year, humanity would likely lose. If they waited 5 years, then Earth would be stronger. If they waited 10 years, then humanity might have ships capable of taking the fight into Kralthek space. The three military leaders stood in silence, considering the future and what it might hold. They had won a great victory, but they all understood that this might only be the beginning of a longer conflict. Humanity had announced its presence to a hostile galaxy, and there was no way to know what other threats might be watching. Captain Foster brought the Defiant into the lunar docking bay, and the damaged cruiser settled onto its landing supports with a groan of stressed metal. The crew began shutting down systems and preparing for evacuation and repairs. Foster walked through the corridors of his ship and saw the scars of battle everywhere. Hull plates were scorched and dented, and some sections were open to vacuum and sealed behind emergency bulkheads. 13 members of his crew had died during the fighting, and Foster had written personal messages to their families. He reached the main airlock and stepped out onto the dock where ground crews were already swarming around the Defiant with repair equipment. A young lieutenant approached and saluted, and told Foster that Admiral Blake wanted to see him as soon as possible. Foster nodded and made his way to a transport shuttle that would take him down to Earth's surface. The flight through Earth's atmosphere gave Foster a view of his homeworld, and from this height the damage was visible but not overwhelming. He could see smoke rising from the 3 cities that had been hit, but he could also see thousands of other cities that were untouched and functioning normally. Humanity had been hurt but not broken, and life would continue. Blake met Foster in a small office rather than the command center, and the Admiral looked older than he had just days ago. The stress of command had carved new lines into his face, and his eyes were tired. He shook Foster's hand and thanked him for his service and his courage. Blake said that the Defiant and her crew had performed beyond all expectations, and their actions had been crucial to Earth's victory. Foster accepted the praise, but he also told Blake that he had only done what any captain would do when defending their home. He asked what would happen now, and Blake explained that Earth needed time to heal and rebuild. The military would remain on high alert, and new defensive systems would be constructed. Humanity would also begin developing ships capable of traveling to other star systems because staying confined to one planet made them vulnerable. Blake revealed that there were already plans to establish colonies on Mars and on moons throughout the solar system. Spreading humanity across multiple worlds would make it much harder for any alien empire to destroy them completely. There were also proposals to build a network of early warning stations beyond the solar system that could detect incoming threats weeks or months in advance. Foster listened and realized that the war with the Kraltheks had changed humanity forever. Before the invasion, people had been divided by national borders and political differences, but now everyone understood that they were part of a single species facing a dangerous universe. The battle had unified Earth in a way that nothing else could have achieved. As Foster prepared to leave, Blake stopped him with one final thought. The Admiral said that the Kraltheks had made a critical mistake when they dismissed humanity as primitive and weak. They had looked at Earth's technology and assumed that humans would be easy to conquer, but technology was not what made humanity dangerous, and what made humans truly formidable was their refusal to give up even when facing impossible odds. Blake explained that humanity had survived ice ages and plagues, and wars and disasters throughout history. Humans had been knocked down countless times, but they always got back up and kept fighting. That determination and resilience was humanity's greatest weapon, and it was something that could not be measured or predicted by analyzing sensor data. The Kraltheks had learned that lesson too late. Foster returned to the lunar docks and rejoined his crew, and together they began the long process of repairing the Defiant. Around the solar system, other ships were being rebuilt, and new weapons were being constructed, and humanity was preparing for whatever might come next. The war had lasted less than a day, but the memory would last forever, and it would serve as a reminder that Earth would defend itself against any threat. The Kraltheks Empire had been warned, and they had laughed at that warning, and now their laughter was silent. Their ships were destroyed, and their commander was dead, and the survivors carried with them the knowledge that humanity was not prey, but predator. The line had been drawn, and the price for crossing it had been paid in full.